If they take out Israel, they remove it from the map, river to the sea, do you think all of the people who are chanting in your cities and the people who are chanting in London and the people who are chanting in New York City and in Brussels, do you think they wrap it up? Okay, I guess we did what we wanted to do. We got rid of Israel. Okay, we're good to go. No, that will just be the beginning. That will just be the beginning of whether you want to call it the worldwide jihad or the return of the caliphate or whatever it is, but it will be deeply anti-Western, so it doesn't matter what you call it. And we will have imported these people into our countries, and we will have said, you come into our countries, use all of our freedoms against us, take out our allies, attack all of our traditions, and then the West will really be over. I see a direct line between what's going on with Israel right now and all of free Western society.
David, thank you so very much for giving us your time. Really appreciate it. It's good to see you again.
John, it's good to see you again. Last we saw each other a couple of months back at the ARC Forum in London, which we don't have many inspiring political moments or cultural moments these days, unfortunately, but that really was one of them for a couple of days, to be around so many sane people and thoughtful thinkers and, of course, the endless energy of Jordan and everything else. So it's good to see you again.
Well, thank you, and sincerely hoping that we can grow ARC into a truly global movement over time. You know, a forum for really high quality thinking, which will expose bad thinking and then present better ways forward, because we seem to live in an age which is just so anti-reason, it's not funny. Now, since we last did a conversation like this, you've moved from California to Florida. I'd be really interested in you giving us an overview of why, because you're not the first person I've heard of that's been pretty keen to get out of California.
I'm certainly not the first, and I'm not the last. Actually, about 1 million people in 3 years, 1 million people have fled California, which was once the dream of America. I mean, the whole idea of move west, build your dreams, go to that undiscovered country, but 1 million people have fled back to the East Coast, to Florida. Several 100,000 have gone to Texas. We see this red-blue divide, which is, I would say, getting more and more divided, would be the way to say it. I did it on December 17th, 21. It's a day that's actually etched in my brain because it was, 2+ years into COVID. The lockdowns, the crazy mandates, the idea that I was, as an employer, going to be able to tell my own employees whether they should be injected with something or not seemed completely insane to me. I was running illegal parties, dinner parties at my house. I couldn't go to restaurants because I wasn't vaxxed. And then it was the series of just ridiculous things that were happening. You could eat outdoors, couldn't eat indoors. If you were standing, you had to wear a mask. If you were sitting, you couldn't. All the stuff that everybody knows, but it was really, I would say, although Australia certainly had an extremely bad version of it, California and LA, where I was specifically, might have had the worst in the world, maybe outside of China. So I fought very hard for the recall of Gavin Newsom, who's the governor of California. I campaigned with my friend Larry Elder, who got a couple million votes, but Gavin Newsom did win that recall. And you'll love this, John. I was audited by the state 3 days after the recall. So after publicly campaigning to get rid of the governor, I was audited by the state. That was about September 15th, 2021. I put my house for sale that very day, and I was out of there by December. And I have to tell you, in the 2+ years that I've been here in Florida, we have no income tax, which is nice, but that's not why I moved. We have rule of law here. We have decency. We have a common understanding of civics here. We defend our First Amendment and our Second Amendment here. We have good education here. We don't have a crazy homeless situation or drugs on the streets. And in many ways, I feel like I live in a different country. And the last thing I'll say is, that's exactly what the founders intended. We have the beautiful system of federalism, so that ever-going experiment is happening between these 50 states. And if you want to be taxed highly and not get a lot in return for it and have to live amongst filth and crime and everything else, then I highly recommend California. If you want to save a little bit more of your money and you want to be amongst people who understand what freedom's really all about and have the means to protect that freedom, I would say go to Florida. And then, of course, there's a whole bunch of states in between that have varying versions of that.
In our own way, we have that in Australia, and we got extraordinarily bad press around the world during COVID, largely out of what happened in one state, Victoria, where the lockdowns were quite extraordinary, and there were images of mothers being dragged off in pajamas in front of their children for daring to question the lockdowns. Now, there's an interesting question that arises out of that, and what's happened in California. You've just referred to it. There seems, despite that sort of authoritarian approach, to be quite substantial political support for it. California is drifting in an extraordinary direction. Victoria here in Australia is drifting in an extraordinary direction, but the voters seem to keep sticking on to the people who adopt these relatively authoritarian approaches and drive economies into the floor. What is it about us en masse that sometimes seems to have us, if you like, vote against our own interests?
Yeah, well, as our friend Jordan Peterson often says, you have to give the devil his due. And I think the branding of the left, that everything is about tolerance and diversity, and they're much nicer, and people on the right are mean and cruel and only care about money. These very simplistic ways of looking at things. I always say it's a very thin veneer, of course. And when you tear that veneer off, you see something much nastier beneath. But I think what they've largely convinced people is that, okay, if you're in California right now, sure, your state income tax is high, you're not getting a lot in return, your streets aren't that great, there's crime, there's homelessness, a lot of shops are closing, all of that, they don't really deny that that's true. Even Gavin Newsom will admit some of that stuff. But what he will say is that Florida is far worse because you can't say gay in Florida. And Florida is far worse because everyone's running around with a gun in Florida. And they're teaching the children all these racist tropes and all this nonsense. And the truth is, the media repeats this ridiculous series of lies over and over and over and convinces people that it's actually true. But what I would say to that is the proof is in the pudding, because yes, you can fool a lot of the people a lot of the time, but you can't fool everybody all the time. And those numbers that I told you before about the million moving out of Cali and where they're going, there is nobody leaving Florida going to California. There's nobody leaving Texas to go to New York. It's only going one way. As a matter of fact, the big joke during COVID was that our U-Haul trucks, the rental trucks to move, and this happened to me when I was moving. We needed 3 trucks to move all of my stuff, 3,000 miles across the country. The owner of the moving company called me and he said, look, I got to tell you, we can't do the rates that are on the website because when we set this up, we were getting trucks going both ways. So you have a moving truck go one way, and then you expect within a couple days it can get somebody to send stuff back west. He said, nobody's going that way anymore, so we can't honor those rates. We have to charge you more for that. So that tells you everything you need to know. I would say there's also another problem right now that the blue and red states are dealing with, which is that as the blue states get bluer and the red states get redder, as people separate, which again, I think is good. That's the beauty of federalism. You don't have to leave the country. You can just go to a different state. The problem is the chances for the resurrection of the blue states become much, much worse because good people leave. So everyone wonders, New York City. I grew up in New York City. I was there for the 20 years under Rudy Giuliani and Mike Bloomberg, where it was an absolute renewal of a city, and it was safe and businesses were flourishing, and it was a wonderful, wonderful place to live and be part of the arts and all of those things. Well, then subsequently, the last decade or so, they've had far-left mayors who have basically ruined it. But the problem is, New York has lost about 500,000 people since COVID. This last gubernatorial election in New York, Kathy Hochul, who's the current governor of New York, she won re-election by about 450,000 votes. Now, it's not to say that every single person who left would have voted for the Republican, but we know that the bulk of them would have. And that separation now is causing the disparity in the states. And I don't know what to do about the cities. I talk about it on my show almost every day. And if you live in a big city, in a big blue city, in a big blue state, my only recommendation would be to move. There's nobody coming to save you. Rudy Giuliani still lives in New York City, but he's not running for mayor again. There just aren't enough good people. And the question always, and I'm sure you face this too in Australia, is what is rock bottom? What would be the thing that would reverse everything and get people to really wake up? I don't know that we know what that is. I don't know that we want to know what that is.
Well, let's consider it's not only people leaving California, as I understand it, it's business. And manufacturing. So what you've actually got now is almost an emerging sort of feudal society, because the wealthiest people in the world, or concentration of people in the world, surely Silicon Valley, I mean, it's stratospheric. They live in ways that none of the rest of us could ever even begin to imagine. Then manufacturing goes. Joel Kotkin makes this point. So your middle income jobs go, and I think I'm right in saying that he told me that some 80% of the emerging jobs in California, in as much as jobs emerge, are low paid, which in America, by Australian standards, is very low paid. It's pretty miserable stuff. So it becomes, if people say they actually care about the disadvantaged, if they really care about a fair go and an opportunity for young people, how long do you go on justifying that in terms of the language that, or the model that you just outlined, that that people say, oh, it's worse elsewhere? You can't hide it forever.
No, you can't hide it forever. And also saying you care and actually caring and do things that would illustrate that obviously are two very different things. So you're making a great point about the destruction of the middle class that's happened in these cities. So San Francisco is probably the best example of this. San Francisco, which was the hub of Silicon Valley, was just pumping out billionaire after billionaire after billionaire. And when you hear the lefties always complain about the billionaire class, it's like, I've met a couple billionaires at this point, and they have huge staffs, and they pay tons of salaries, and they buy all sorts of properties and yachts and all sorts of things. And we can talk about how much they should be taxed, but they create something of value, and then that value trickles down into all sorts of jobs and everything else. What's happened now, unfortunately, because so many people have left, now you have this very thin layer of super rich people, and all of the people that they staff, who let's say would normally be middle class people, they don't want to live in the city of San Francisco anymore because of the drugs and the crime and everything else. About a year ago, I got a text randomly in the middle of the day, and it was Elon Musk asking me to go over to Twitter and meet with him that night. And I jumped on a plane and I somehow got there that night. And I stood in an office with Elon Musk at about 12:30 a.m. in San Francisco. And the office, it's a corner office, windows both ways. And he's standing there pointing out to me, okay, that's where they get the drugs. That's where they do the drugs. Then they move like a blob, like a zombie movie. They move over there, and that's where they all fall asleep. And we watched it happen. And that's what's happening all across San Francisco. So a middle class person no longer wants to live in San Francisco. So you have a lower class now and a drug-filled class and homelessness and all that. Restaurants closing every which way. You can't open up a mom and pop store anymore because riots could come. They can break your windows, whatever. The cops aren't going to stop if someone walks in and steals the items out of your store. So you have this lower class that's kind of crumbling. The middle class can't afford to live in the city. And now the elites over there, they are having trouble even staffing for themselves because nobody wants to live there. So it's a cascading problem. And again, just saying you're for these people, I mean, that's what the Democrats, or I would say the progressives, are really great at. We're for the poor people. We're for the black and brown people and the disadvantaged. Except every single one of their policies produces the opposite outcome. So at some point, I'm not that cynical of a person, but at some point you might think that maybe they're not doing this with the best of intentions. I don't think they could be that obtuse, let's put it that way.
A lot of what you're talking about in Florida, of course, and a lot of the reason, I suppose, one of the reasons why so many people on the left deride the place is down to the leadership of Ron DeSantis. He seems to me to have been a very courageous and a very outspoken sort of individual, and I think you're a very strong supporter of his. So Florida's doing well, and as an outsider looking in, and I was in both that state and California not so very long ago, and you can certainly feel the difference. You can see it too. I'll never forget the litter and the dirt and the filth in LA. I was really surprised by it. And you didn't see that in Florida. But Ron DeSantis seems to have been a very good leader in that state. What has gone wrong with his presidential bid, or what went wrong with it?
Well, I think the answer can be summed up in one word, and that's Trump. I think that he did not know exactly how to deal with Trump. And you have to remember, the news cycle is so fast these days, people forget things. And when Donald Trump announced that he was running for president, which is now over a year ago, there wasn't a tremendous amount of momentum behind it, actually, because there weren't all these court cases. There wasn't all of this other sideshow nonsense happening. And it was just like, oh, Trump's just running again, and he's angry that, in his view, they stole the election, and that's it. And also we were all, America, and I think the world at large, was still very focused on the COVID recovery. And that's where DeSantis really shined. So you had DeSantis really going like this, and you had Trump sort of flat like this. Then what happened was all of these court cases come, they're going after Trump, it gets the base really riled up again. And I think DeSantis just did not know how to go against that. And I can't blame him for that. And actually, I would say, since he has now stepped out of the race, which it's about 2 months ago now, I have to say, as a Floridian, I'm thrilled. I mean, even if you look at his legislative session that they're in the midst of right now, we're having this huge problem in America with squatters' rights, which don't even exist. It doesn't make sense. The idea that you can just walk into somebody's house and because they're not there, you can basically take over the house. That's happening actually in New York and California right now. He's taking care of that. We've had all of this crazy illegal immigration stuff, and he's having our police officers deport people to other states, and we're moving people. So we're doing everything right here. I think the simple answer is they didn't know how to deal with Trump. I don't know that anyone could, but I will say that having DeSantis back here as my governor and potentially Trump as my president, that will be just fine with me. It's not to say Trump is perfect. Obviously, I voted for him last time, and I support a lot of the stuff, and he may be the only wrecking ball that can do anything for these much, much bigger monolithic problems that we have. But DeSantis, the funny thing, John, and you could tell me, you've been in politics way longer than I've been doing this. Did you ever find a politician that did every policy everyone wanted, had absolutely no scandals around him, was the right age, had the right family, just absolutely had a perfect track record, didn't lie, didn't overpromise, did everything we could all ask, and somehow wasn't good enough for the base? Have you ever seen a politician like that on our shores, your shores, or anywhere else? Because that's what he got left with, and I think that's largely just because of the shadow of Trump. It just is.
It is quite extraordinary because as we sit here, the thing that people most often say to me as an Australian watching America is, how does a nation of 300 million plus come to this point where you've so deeply divided that it's almost impossible to see the country coming back together? And I understand your point about states competing, and that being a good thing because, in theory, the better ones provide incentive for the laggards to pull their socks up and what have you. That was the idea. But if you look at the extent of the division now, you wonder whether a DeSantis or anybody could have managed to pull the country back together. And that's very important. America is still the global police officer, keeping some degree of law and order. And one wonders where this is going to land.
Right. So that's a great question, because we are, whether we like it or not. I mean, look, America could step back, and there's a very strong isolationist movement growing on the right in America right now, and I'm sympathetic to it. This is a bit of like a Tucker Carlson sort of take on things, that we have so many big problems here, we have no right to be doing anything anywhere. I'm actually quite sympathetic to that argument philosophically. I think in practicality, if not for the United States, the world would be in a much, much worse place, not only historically, but I still think going forward, someone will lead the world one way or another. So unless you want China to rule the world or you want Russia to rule the world, then the United States, for all her flaws, probably is the best country. That doesn't mean that every foreign policy thing we do is great and that we should be nation building all over the place and everywhere else. But to your earlier point, as we see this divide, we are called the United States of America. And you're right, we're going to have to figure out what unites us, because if we sort ourselves out, and okay, all like-minded people live in red states and people who think the other way live in blue states, eventually we'll just be at war with ourselves. That's obviously a huge problem. We already had one civil war, fairly close to our founding. But the other problem I think that people can't quite grasp is that this isn't a problem of, I want a marginal tax rate of 10% and you want 20%. This isn't really a problem of, I want 10-week abortion and you want 15-week abortion. The problem is that we are ideologically opposed to each other in very, very deep ways right now. The left, which now the radical left, which took control of the Democrat Party, they believe that the founding of America was evil. They believe that America is systemically racist. They believe that if only the government had more power, it could rejigger society in some sort of what they would describe as a utopian manner. Of course, we know it would actually end in a dystopian manner. They think that boys are girls. They think that by not arresting criminals, you de-incentivize criminality. Almost every position, and we could go do many more of these, almost every position that they've taken is so radically antithetical to reality that I don't know how do you mend with that? Because we have a certain set of people who kind of want to live and let live. We understand what our rights are, and we want to be able to protect ourselves and speak freely, and so be it. And then we have a bunch of other people that radically want to transform that into something else. How you arbitrage those two things, I don't know. I don't think anyone knows. And by the way, I don't think Trump can do it, and I certainly don't think Biden can do it. I think RFK has a little bit more of a message that kind of gets us there, but he's running third party, so that doesn't seem likely. And I don't think it's really a political answer. I think it's more of a spiritual answer that we all have to think about.
So no one seems to use the term worldview anymore, but what you're really talking about is two totally different worldviews that are almost irreconcilable. One of the ways in which it seems to show up in particularly the English-speaking Western countries is a loathing of country amongst younger people. They've been taught, as you've just touched on it, loathe their own country. And I understand that the numbers of baby boomer Americans who still will say, I am proud to be American, are very, very high, 3/4 or so. But by the time you get down to Americans under 30, it drops to a 20 or so, 15 to 20% only who can say they're proud to be Americans. That reflects, to use that old-fashioned word, I would have thought two vastly different worldviews. But there's a little bit of evidence that particularly younger men are drifting back to the centre, and you're at the cutting edge of the debate about who we are and how we're going to live, and conveying that through the new media. A broad question, but the horrible trends first. Is there any hope? Are people coming back? It's recentering.
Yes.
And can we do it quickly enough?
Well, that's a different question. Is there hope? The answer, of course, is yes, because humans have gone through far worse things than we're going through right now. I mean, we survived World War I, we survived World War II. There are always bad, oppressive forces that exist. There are always authoritarian regimes. Now, we have another complex problem right now because so many of the bad ideas are being fueled by algorithms. We don't know how China is manipulating us. We also know that not only is our border open, but the amount of drugs that are coming through. So if you have a population that not only is hooked on illegal drugs, but also I think it's something like 12% of American adults are on, prescription drugs, antidepressants, SSRIs. So we have a largely drugged population too. I mean, there's huge problems. That being said, not only have humans been through huge problems before, but I think when you push people to a certain degree, there is something innately human that causes them to push back. So you just referenced that young males now tend to be skewing, it's not quite conservative, but they're skewing more, let's say, in line with reality. They know that their body matches their gender. These basic things, they know that they're not bad just because they're white. Like, there's been such an absolutely terrible virus pushed on these people, and something innate about them actually is the antidote to it. So I do suspect that Gen Z will really start, which this is, sort of the under 25s, let's say, will really start the pushback on this. I would also say, John, that, I think one of the huge problems that we have right now is that my generation, I'm 47 years old, so I'm right in the middle of Gen X. I'm the generation that's supposed to be in charge right now. Ron DeSantis is 45. He's the generation that's supposed to be in charge right now. Elon Musk, I think, is early 50s. He's supposed to be in charge right now. Unfortunately, the great generation, or the boomer, there was the great generation, the greatest generation, and then the boomers. The boomers have largely held on for so long that they're not allowing the room for the transfer of power. The idea that Donald Trump or Joe Biden should be in charge when they were born, neither one of them, there wasn't color TV. That's not being ageist. I have a great admiration for older people. I actually like hanging out with older people more than young people usually. But there is a generational problem there. The world is so different in the 20 plus, the 25 years of this thing, this iPhone. The world is in our pocket right now, and we're asking people who grew up in a time listening to AM radio to solve those problems. It's also a function of success, of course, because people are living longer, healthier lives because of science, and that's wonderful. But when you look at the elite in America, the elite political class, whether it's Donald Trump or Joe Biden, or Mitch McConnell, or Nancy Pelosi. The list goes on and on of these people who are in their 70s and 80s and should be spending more time with their grandchildren and making room for the new generation to step in. And it's a damn shame. So if my generation gets skipped, which I do think is largely possible, then I suppose we have to hand it to the 25-year-olds to fix it.
I think there's a lot of legitimacy to what you're saying. I'm a mid-baby boomer, and there'll be a lot of people who say, well, you ought to just butt out altogether. But, all I'm trying to do is actually try and bring good thinking to
you're one of the good ones,
make
John.
it accessible for people.
Yeah, you're one of the good ones. But that's the point. It's not really about age, obviously, because there are, it's funny. I saw Frankie Valli in the Four Seasons. Frankie Valli is 89 years old. I saw the guy perform about 2 months ago. I met him afterwards. He's full of vim and vigor and having a blast. 2-hour concert performance, no intermission, 89 years old. And I'm watching him thinking, man, Joe Biden, I think, is 80 or 81. He couldn't do this for 5 minutes, what this guy's doing. So it's not about age. It's about something else. And it's about cognitive awareness. It's about an openness to the world and a new way of thinking that also incorporates a lot of old ways of thinking. I just don't think we have the best of the best doing it right now.
Yeah, I think where I was wanting to sort of go with this, you touched on it. Maybe the problems are partly spiritual. It seems to me that part of the new, if you like, worldview is somehow related to the idea that you can be an island, that everybody can be so radically individual, so totally in control. Nobody else dare interfere with my autonomy, even to the extent of telling me what sex I am. Versus an older model that said that you can't simply worship self. You actually have to recognise that if you matter, so does your neighbour. And that's what's washed out of the system. And everything now seems to be about the pursuit of personal autonomy, which ultimately brings you into clash with everybody else around you if they're into self-autonomy as well, rather than cooperation and recognition. So really what I'm painting is a picture of a world that's detached, in the West, that's detached itself from the well springs of its own spiritual and cultural perspectives and become obsessed with self in a way that is destroying self, if I can put it that way.
Well, there was a line that I heard you say a few times at ARC that I've repeated several times since, which was that we've forgotten to tell our story. And the story of the West is not just a story of an individual who picked up and created everything. It's that we started creating families and communities and figuring out what we want to do and making sure the government was off our back enough to be able to do it, but that we still did have a government. There were and that we had religious institutions. We also had strong secular institutions for a long time. I mean, people think, oh my God, how did this woke thing just appear out of nowhere? Well, it didn't appear out of nowhere. They went through the long march through the institutions. They look at what's going on at Harvard and Columbia and all these universities right now. And it's like, oh, this didn't just spring out of nowhere that they're basically creating Hamas clone students. It's been going on for quite some time. So we forgot to tell how great the story of the West is, that it's not just about you. It's largely about you. Look, the individual is the smallest minority. That's a great Ayn Rand line. But most people are not objectivists, Ayn Rand thinkers. You realize that it starts with you, and then you have to start building up above that. And if we really sell that story, what better story is there than the story of America? The story of this place across the ocean where everyone from literally every corner on Earth has wanted to come, and almost everybody, really with almost no exceptions, when they got here, their life was better, and then their children's life was better, and the grandchildren, et cetera, et cetera. Now that may be shifting now, meaning that it is quite possible that my children's life will not be as broadly successful as mine because the conditions no longer will match. That is possible. But the dream, the 250-year dream of America, is the most beautiful dream that has almost existed in the human mind. And that we've sort of thrown that away because there were some mistakes along the way and because the founders had slaves while they were also writing the laws to free the slaves, so we should just burn up the whole thing. But unfortunately, I think it also goes to that generally conservative-leaning people, and I would include classical liberals in this. We're out and about. We're doing things. We're building businesses. We're with our families. We're building communities. The lefties tend to be really focused on the mission. So it's much easier for them to coordinate and destroy when it takes a lot more work to build and do good.
But Dave, it's not just people in America, not just people in Australia who have done well out of democratic capitalism and the freedoms that we've had. The left never seem to want to acknowledge it. But the truth is that particularly since the end of the Second World War, the global sort of stability that's been provided largely with American leadership and American policing and Western know-how, scientific research. I'm involved in agriculture, have been all my life. The extension of that knowledge internationally, available and affordable energy, has lifted countless billions of people out of short, brutish lives. Life expectancy in most of the majority world has doubled. Educational opportunities have gone through the roof. Health has improved out of sight. And yet we never give ourselves credit for that, nor do we acknowledge, as we seek to pull down our culture and everything it stands for, that if it's gone, it won't be just us who misses out. I don't see much care for the less fortunate in the world coming out of the arc of autocracy, if I can put it that way. The people and nations, they have nothing in common except that they're loathing of the West. Let's talk Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. They don't care. There's not much evidence that they care about the disadvantaged. So it isn't just us that have benefited from the global order that's been overseen by the Americans. We're at risk in destroying ourselves of driving the world back into a much, much uglier place for the majority of its inhabitants, in my view.
Yeah, well, I would say that maybe this would be an interesting segue to talk about what's going on with Israel and Hamas, because, when we talk about American leadership and we talk about Western ideals and where did these things come from, and the stories of the Bible and all of these things, and how did it happen? How did it happen that some miraculous civilizations existed where people were truly tolerant and all of these things? I think what we're seeing on the streets of all of our countries, actually one of the most jarring things that I saw in the last 6 months since October 7th was on the streets of Sydney, Australia, at the Opera House where Jordan and I performed. That was the last show that we did together on that wonderful tour in 2018. And there was out of several hundred people out there chanting "Gas the Jews." I know it was a huge story in your country, and it was a huge story here. And we don't cover Australia that often here in America. But I think largely what's happening in the world right now is there is a rejection of the best way I can phrase it is sort of liberal world order. There is a rejection of sort of the post-World War II. The post-World War II regime, let's say, and that's largely pointed at America. And then, of course, when things are pointed at America, then they're pointed at Israel. And Israel's in an existential battle for its existence, but I would say that battle for its existence is actually an existential battle for your existence and my existence and everyone that's listening to this show or watching this show that lives in a Western society. If they take out Israel, so let's say they do it. They remove it from the map, river to the sea. Do you think all of the people who are chanting in your cities and the people who are chanting in London and the people who are chanting in New York City and in Brussels, do you think they wrap it up? Okay, I guess we did what we wanted to do. We got rid of Israel. Okay, we're good to go. No, that will just be the beginning. that will just be the beginning of whether you want to call it the worldwide jihad or the return of the caliphate or whatever it is, but it will be deeply anti-Western, so it doesn't matter what you call it. And we will have imported these people into our countries, and we will have said, you come into our countries, use all of our freedoms against us, take out our allies, attack all of our traditions. We'll likely pay you for it because we'll give you social services while you do it. And then the West will really be over. So the battle for the West, I see a direct line between what's going on with Israel right now and all of free Western society.
And to reinforce your point, I find it unbelievable that so many otherwise seemingly thoughtful and decent middle people, middle Australians, middle Brits, middle Americans, are siding with Hamas without realising it, I suspect. If they had endless demands for a ceasefire always aimed at Israel, when the obvious point is that if you want the thing to stop, you tell Hamas, get out from your cowardly position behind women and children and stand up like people of some courage and face the consequences of your actions. You're the people who caused this. You're the people who can stop it.
It's as simple as that,
when we call for
John.
Israel to stop it, not Hamas, I immediately find myself thinking, why are you not understanding that it's Hamas that we need to be calling on?
Well, unfortunately, the real answer for that, of course, is that so many people have been bamboozled for decades with just completely wrong information about Israel and quote-unquote Palestine and everything else. I mean, I don't need to give you a history lesson here, but there never was a country known as Palestine. Obviously, there was the British Mandate of Palestine, which is the ancient land of Israel. A famous Jew by the name of Jesus of Nazareth lived in a place that we now call the West Bank, which used to be known as Judea and Samaria. You'll never believe who lived in Judea, which of course that's the story of Hanukkah, that whether you're Jewish or not, basically everyone knows that story, the Jews defending the Judean hills against the Greek invaders. I was just in Israel a couple of weeks ago, and to walk that land and to walk in those areas and go to Jerusalem and see all these things, you can breathe and live history, but there's been just an abject demolition of what true history is. So then many people take the wrong side on it. But I would also say, to your point, you're completely right, obviously. This war could be over by the time I finish this sentence. All Hamas would have to do is surrender and return the hostages, assuming some of them are still alive, which who knows if they are. But short of that, and their goal obviously is not a ceasefire. Their goal is they want to bleed Israel out, meaning, okay, they can't win militarily, but you can hopefully just turn enough of the world against the Jews. It's just kind of the story of every Jewish holiday. The world came for us, a bunch of us died, but here we are, we still survived. So Israel will survive this. But I would also say that the real way for this to end, and this has been the saddest part of the American policy on this, is we know the entire Hamas leadership is at a hotel in Qatar. Everyone knows it, no one disputes it. And we could have said to Qatar on October 8th, if you do not have Hamas stand down right now and return those soldiers, we are going to blow up Qatar. Qatar is a tiny country, nobody would have cared. This thing would have been over immediately, but we have a completely feckless administration. And again, we don't know who's running it. I mean, that's the real problem with talking American politics these days. We can lay everything at the footsteps of Joe Biden, but the question is who really is running the policy? Because I don't think actually that it's Joe Biden. I don't know who it is, but either way, he's the figurehead for it.
It must be very concerning to astute observers in Israel to note that Biden may be the last Democrat president who supports Israel, at least on paper. And if you look at Great Britain, still a very significant power and a place that understands the world because of their history as much as anything else, you now have the ugly reality that a change of government is likely to mean that the Labor Party would depend upon a very large number of seats that can be determined by what might be called an anti-Israel vote. So that loss of support amongst the West, as you say, opens the way, I would have thought, for something even uglier extending across the world if Israel is not supported now, if people don't wake up at what the real issues are in all of this.
Yeah, look, there's a demographics problem across the world, for sure. I would say, putting Israel aside, the UK has a demographics problem as it relates to immigrants and radical Islam and everything else. And if you're, I mean, Sadiq Khan, who's the mayor of London, I actually think he's quite radical in his personal beliefs. But even the Prime Minister of England right now, who has, to your point, of the UK, to your point, he's not going to be Prime Minister that much longer, likely. I don't think he's that radical, actually. But I think what's happening is, if you wake up every Sunday morning for 6 months and see 200,000 Muslims and leftists marching through your streets and shutting down your streets and shutting down bridges and everything else, at some point you just start appeasing them if you don't have a backbone. And we don't have many great leaders with backbones. I would say, the Netherlands just elected Geert Wilders, and he seems like he's going to be a little bit stronger on this stuff. But Italy elected Meloni, and it seemed like she was going to be great on this, and Italy still has a huge problem with immigration. So there are demographic problems that are internal problems for all of these countries. The United States has a much lesser problem with this because we've integrated people way better. We had the melting pot, where in Europe it was largely, we're going to kind of keep these separate. Yeah, they can all say they're British, but these people are really Pakistani, and these are the real Brits. We did it much better in America for generations. And by the way, that's another thing that the left has really started to shred, because they have everybody thinking about their ethnicity and their skin color way more than being American, and that's a damn shame, and we have to fix that if possible. But I would say it's an internal demographics problem, and then that internal demographics problem becomes an external problem as it relates to Israel. But I'm sure you saw the story a couple weeks ago. I mean, they're violently threatening members of parliament in the UK who support Israel. They're violently threatening them, showing up to their homes. Well, at some point, if you're a member of parliament and people keep showing up to your home, threatening you and your family, you might just vote the other way. That's just self-preservation. So if we don't stand up, we're at a very weird moment. If we do not stand up for Western ideals across the world, pretty much right now, I would say we got a couple months left, because you're right, the American election could largely change everything in a way that is beyond estimation. Then maybe it will be over, and we'll all look back and go, boy, that 2024 was pretty good, because it's going to be 2036 and things will be significantly worse.
You've just been in Israel, as you mentioned. Israeli citizens must feel that the world expects them to do the right thing, but will never give them a fair hearing, and that they're hated, so they've got no choice at all but to press on. I find it abhorrent that the Jewish people, after everything they suffered in the 20th century, should feel that the rest of the world doesn't understand or care for the way in which they themselves have been victims, frankly. Victims in circumstances that most of us find so disgusting you can hardly even read about them. I've just been reading a detailed account of how Auschwitz actually operated and what it was like. And to have been traumatised as a people in the way that the Jewish people have been, and then to find that the world's forgotten so quickly, must be deeply galling and very troubling.
Well, I can tell you this, from I talk to Israelis across the political spectrum, across the socioeconomic spectrum, from every part of the country. It's a tiny country the size of New Jersey. I mean, at parts it's only barely 10 miles wide, so it's a very, very tiny country. But I didn't get the sense that anyone wants pity. They would just prefer that the world not stop them from protecting themselves, which is a very different thing. I think they're largely past pity. They've lived through suicide bombings, they've lived through stabbing sprees, they've lived through bus bombings and car rammings and just endless terrorism all the time. It's built into their way of life, as is survival. So I don't think they want pity, but they would prefer that the United States or the world at large not actively attack them or diplomatically attack them while they are trying to get their own hostages back. It is my belief, at least, that you as a nation have every right to do everything possible to defend your citizens. And if one of your citizens was kidnapped or taken across enemy lines, to do whatever you can to get them. We used to have something in America called the Powell Doctrine. Of course, it was Colin Powell under George W. Bush, who is our black Secretary of State. I don't care about his skin color, but it's worth noting in a time when everyone's focused on skin. But the whole idea of the Powell Doctrine was you attack with overwhelming force so that your enemy backs up quickly, retreats quickly, gives up quickly. Israel, oddly, in this situation, has texted people, leave this house. We know Hamas is living downstairs. Leave this mosque. They drop leaflets. They do all of these things. And I think many Israelis are kind of coming around to this too, it doesn't buy them any goodness with the world. I think that's perhaps there might be some deep sort of religious historical connections to that. The story of the Jews is a story. It's quite a painful story. So people expect Jews to kind of be killed, and that's expected. You don't really give them much pity for it. And again, I don't think they want pity. But I think that what they're learning right now is they can rely on themselves. They can hope that their allies will be there for them, but they have to do what they have to do, just like any nation would. Any nation, if Australia, you guys are surrounded by water, so it's a little bit different for you guys. But any nation that had in effect a country, an army on the border committed to its destruction, you would take them out before they took you out. You would have to do it. It would be your duty, your responsibility, and I would also argue it would be your God-given right.
The left, of course, used to be very supportive of Israel. It's not now, it seems. What happened? Why has the left turned? It used to be conservatives who were often a bit reluctant to support the state of Israel. Is it really as simple as saying, well, support for Israel has been lost in this new idea of the oppressed and oppressor, victim and victim maker ideology? Because it seems to me that it's an absurdity, going back to my earlier point.
Oh, it's an absurdity.
That Jewish people are oppressors, that they're colonizers. Nobody has suffered more. No one's been more oppressed by others than the Jewish people. Is this ideology so powerful that it's turned the left's mind altogether?
Well, as it pertains to Israel specifically, yes, there's the simple version is the oppressed-oppressor narrative. So the Palestinians are oppressed and the Israelis are the oppressors. So they don't have to think about it much more. Remember earlier I talked about that very thin veneer. So they're very good at these bumper sticker things, and only when you peel the veneer you see that usually it's nonsense. I would say that's part of it. The other part of it is, of course, what identity politics has done to everyone's brains here, well, I would say in America, but really across the world, which is somehow it is thought of, well, Jews, you guys are oddly successful. That's pretty weird. How did you become successful? You're a minority, and minorities are supposed to be unsuccessful. So we're going to have to throw you under the bus, and that's how it works. And look, it's the same thing to, let's say, Asians in America who get discriminated against at college admissions. We know this. Harvard was discriminating against Asians. Why would you discriminate? Okay, I want more black kids at Harvard. Well, you're going to have to discriminate against somebody, and you end up discriminating against the hardworking Asian kids. So that's just sort of a lesser version of what they're doing to Jews, because Harvard, it's well known that they used to discriminate against Jews on the same ground. So I think some people, there's the political version, which is the oppressed-oppressor narrative. And then I think there's the spiritual version, which I think people are much less aware of. I think they just kind of think, you Jews have had it too good. You just kind of had it. It doesn't really make sense. What do you mean? You survived the Holocaust and then you became successful? That doesn't really work. It doesn't fit the calculator. The left needs their minorities to be oppressed. So if you dare succeed, well, they're going to make sure that doesn't last too long. But I think the Israelis are probably a bit too smart for that.
In my view, none of this could have unfolded in the way it has if history was taught properly in our schools and universities.
Yes,
those who control history control the future.
Look, there's so many, I mean, I don't want to do a history lesson on the history of the Middle East, which I'm sure you're well aware of. But if people had any knowledge of the truth of that, or you wouldn't even have to go back 2,000 years. You don't even have to go back to the time of Jesus, although, we're taping this right around Easter and it's worth thinking about. And I was at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem just 2 weeks ago. It's an incredibly moving place. And if you think that church doesn't have significance now, you're crazy. It absolutely does. So as I said before, you can walk and breathe history right there, but people don't know basic history. But let's say you don't want to go back 2,000 years. Well, you could go back, say, I don't know, to 1948, you could go back 75 years, and you could go back to the end of World War II and the dissolution of the British Empire, and that they offered two people, two states, and that the Arabs, there were no people known as the Palestinians at the time. The Arabs of Palestine said no. The Jews said yes. They've offered them states 5 times. Gaza has a huge border with Egypt. That border has massive walls and massive ditches and massive security. Even right now, John, let's try, this is a good thought experiment. Let's pretend that Israel was the most genocidal, out of control, psychotic, bloodthirsty state in the history of the world. They were Nazis on steroids. Why would, of course that's not true, but let's just pretend it was true. All the things that the people chanting in the streets are saying are true. Why has nobody called for Egypt to open up the door? Sinai, which sits right there, which Israel used to control, is 4 times the size of all of Israel. Sinai, there's almost nobody in Sinai. You could let all those people into Sinai today. They won't do it. Because none of this has anything to do with giving the Palestinians a state. It has to do with destroying Israel. As you know, John, the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, that's an apartheid nation. If you want to look at an apartheid nation, the Hashemite rulers rule over their Palestinian majority population. Or go to Lebanon, where Palestinians aren't allowed to have, I think, 30 some odd types of jobs or own land, et cetera, because they don't want them there either. So it has nothing to do. The Jews are just an easy foil for a bunch of bad regimes to retain power. But if anyone cared about any of these people, Egypt would open up the border and save their brothers. But nobody cares.
Let's engage in another hypothetical for a moment. You've touched on the need for leadership, and there's been an incredible lack of it in most of the West. Why are our leaders not simply pointing to some of the issues that you've just highlighted, some of the realities, some of the facts? They're not really doing it. They're not standing up. How, in your view, and this is the hypothetical, would some of the great leaders from that last great civilizational moment, the 1940s, have responded? And what do you think a Churchill or a Roosevelt or a Truman would have said and tried to convey to their people in these circumstances?
Oh, it's a great question. What a fun thought exercise. Well, I think it would have been very similar for all 3 of them. Which, first off, there would have been a clear moral position. Putting aside whatever you think about the history of the land or anything else, you cannot burst into a country's borders and rape its women and behead people and murder. And, John, I saw the 47-minute video. There's a video that the IDF is only showing to select members of the media and some dignitaries because family members of people that are being murdered and attacked in the videos don't want it to be fully released. So for all of the horrific videos that people have seen about it, it's worse. I've seen things that I won't even begin to explain to you here. But I think there would have been absolute moral clarity. Winston Churchill, or if it was Truman, Roosevelt, it wouldn't have mattered. There would have been moral clarity. You have a duty to defend your citizens, period. The irony, of course, is that the Israelis don't want any boots on the ground. They don't want American troops. They don't want British troops. They don't want Australian troops. They'd like some weapons. They'd like to be able to do the job and not run out of ammunition while doing it. On top of the fact that one of the main takeaways that I had from being there was that the real war hasn't even started there, because the real war is the war in the north with Hezbollah, which is far more powerful than Hamas. You know that there's 100,000 Israelis that don't live in their homes since October 7th from the north. Gaza's in the south. The hotel that I stayed at in Tel Aviv was quite a nice hotel. It was largely refugees from the north. So there is a war coming after this war that potentially could be worse than this war. But I think if we just simply had clear moral leadership, we certainly would have got it from Winston Churchill, and of course Truman was the first Western leader to recognize Israel in 1948. I think that that's all they would have needed. It would have just been a little bit of leadership, but we don't have great leaders across the board. I think that there's some glimmers of hope out there, but we don't, unfortunately, have many of them right now.
Well, Dave, that brings us back to this very pivotal year, I suspect, for humanity at large. That's how big it is, I think, what happens in America this year. As I look at it, I should be careful of making judgments, but I do so as an admirer of America, and one that wants to see America, I'm not saying it's perfect, but maintain its its leadership, you know, one really wonders whether there's any chance of a Joe Biden doing a full second term, for example. Will he, maybe it's a basic or a silly question, but will he really be the candidate for the Democrats? That's what a lot
Nobody
of Australians
knows, and that's the thing. Nobody knows. He could fall down or up the stairs and break a hip tomorrow. I mean, anything could happen, and then they have Kamala Harris, who was polling at about 1% in her own party when she dropped out, when she was running against Joe Biden to be president a couple of years ago. Then they have a huge mess on their hands, and I have never met one single person who thinks that she's competent enough to be president of the United States. So as we talk about all of these huge issues that are occurring right now, whether it's the border or the basic stuff as it pertains to biological reality, we need serious people. Actually, that is one thing that I thought when I was in Israel. This is a serious country, a serious group of people who have a common history and a set of traditions and things of that nature. And because of the violence that has constantly been after them, they look at things very seriously and they try to deal with problems seriously. That doesn't mean they always succeed. October 7th is a catastrophic failure that we probably won't know the true nature of for many, many years. But I was thinking, you know, if something terrible, something unheard of, like an October 7th happened in America, we have almost no serious leaders anymore. We don't have a trusted class of media experts to analyze things properly. Everyone will probably just go off further into their own caves. And some people will be thrilled that America got attacked. And some people will think it was this conspiracy or that conspiracy. We have very few things that are tying us together anymore. So when a country does not honor its history, does not know how to go back and tell its story properly and marvel at the founding fathers as opposed to trying to tear down their statues, well then, when something really bad happens, which in my estimation, unfortunately, seems inevitable. I'm not a very black-pilled person generally. I would say, I'm not an eternal optimist. I would say I'm a world-weary optimist. And I think you have to be to do what we do for a living, right? You have to, because you believe you can help shift the world or at least slightly position it in a better way. But if you look at what has happened in America over the last couple of years, where 7 million people have come into our border, we don't know who they are in 3 years. 3 years, 7 million people. It seems inevitable that something terrible is going to happen. And if it happens, how will we get through that? That Joe Biden's going to bring the country together? And I'll even take the other version of it. Do you think Donald Trump will bring the country together? That is going to be a huge problem. On top of the fact that at least we used to have a media class that made sense. We had some people, Walter Cronkite, who was trusted by kind of everybody, regardless of political stripes. We don't have that now. So some people will turn to Joe Rogan, I suppose. Some people will turn to me. Some people will turn to whatever. And who knows what we'll all agree on. I don't know. I don't know.
Well, it is concerning. On the issue of isolationism, it's worth noting, it's quite extraordinary. On the very eve, two things happened, little moments of history. The night before Pearl Harbor. One was that the Australian Embassy in Canberra was opened, unbelievably, the very night before Pearl Harbor. And of course, Australia was to turn to America after the Japanese entered the war, as opposed to relying on Great Britain. And the other one was that the US Senate was still debating the importance of remaining out of the global conflict the night before Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt knew full well that civilization would not survive without American involvement and his personal leadership. He knew that. It doesn't seem to me that President Trump recognises that. I was talking to some American critics of his, there are some here in Australia, when he was president, and they reeled off all the things I hated about him. Then one of them said, "But you're an Australian, you're not an American, so we shouldn't be telling you about our president. But what do you think of him?" And I said, well, from our point of view, he has called out China, and that's important for Australia. And it was very interesting that those two critics of Trump both immediately said, well, yes, that actually is something he's got right.
Well,
and the impression we have now is that he may be part of that sort of Republican desire to withdraw from global leadership.
You know, I'm actually not totally convinced of that. I think there's absolutely a strain of that, right? So let's say the Tucker Carlson version of the right now that's going in that direction. Obviously, Tucker likes Trump and is going to, you know, I think he said he's voting for Trump. So there's definitely energy behind that. The thing with Trump is the last thing that Trump is an ideologue. He's a lot of things, but he's not an ideologue. So I don't think Trump has a particularly cohesive set of views as it pertains to politics, but he has a very cohesive set of views as it pertains to just sort of how to operate in the world. So, you know, Trump, what was one of the first things that he did when he became president? Remember, he dropped the mother of all bombs in Iraq, and everyone was like, what in the world is he doing? And nobody really knew what he was doing, other than he was sending a message to people. Just watch out for America. You don't know what we're going to do. He killed Soleimani. Everyone said the world is going to burn the next day. The world didn't burn the next day. As a matter of fact, we suddenly got 7 peace deals and the Abraham Accords. So although I understand that there will be a certain energy to maybe shift him a little more into the isolationist wing, and that's not to say, look, we might be able to change some things on the margins that would maybe get us out of some conflicts. You know, most Americans wanted to get out of Afghanistan. The way we did the withdrawal was a horrific national embarrassment, I would say. But I think most people don't want to be in these endless wars and wonder why we are protecting Ukraine's borders more than we're protecting our own borders. But I would say the good thing about Trump is he understands the world as it is. And if he got in, even if the energy of the base was a little bit more to the strain that you're concerned about, the base goes where Trump wants them to go. And I think he has a good understanding that power and that, you know, speaks, well, I was going to say speak softly and carry a big stick. That's not quite right with him because he doesn't speak softly. But the stick matters with this guy. Let's put it this way. He's got a big stick and you never know when he's going to use it. That also has some value.
You've been very generous with your time. You really have a very, very clear-sighted understanding of how things are unfolding in your country, but it's impossible, I know, to predict what might happen over the rest of 2024. But what's your gut feeling? What do you think are the most likely scenarios, Dave? You're a very shrewd observer. You've done a lot of deep thinking. You're plainly concerned about it.
I'm definitely concerned about it. Look, on the political side, if you just listen to the polls right now, Trump is in the lead, and it seems like minorities are breaking, and we're seeing a whole bunch of things happen with the Democrats. And I think largely because of the protests we've seen since October 7th. I think Jews are leaving the Democrats in droves, blacks are leaving the Democrats in droves, gay people have seen the end of identity politics. So there's all sorts of reasons to believe that Trump can win an election, for sure. At the same time, there's just so many X factors right now. Biden's health is an X factor. Trump's health actually could be an X factor. He's no spring chicken. Who knows what happens, as I laid out a very dark future a moment ago as it relates to immigration and some of the things that could happen in our borders. That could be a problem. You know, we never got, and your country neither, ever got any sort of, we never tied COVID into a nice little wrapped package and said, okay, we're not going to do this again. So some version of COVID or disease X could come back. You know, we can go through the litany of things that could happen along the way. I would say the best thing, if Trump and Biden are the two candidates that we will be sitting with that first week of November, the best thing that could happen for America would be that Trump would win in a landslide. And through winning in a landslide, and then, as he has said when he's at his best, the best revenge will be success. And if he can get America back on track and get people to be proud of the country again and get the world to see that America is ready to lead again, then maybe it can revert some of this stuff. Now, of course, the problem with that is that we know what the left will do if Trump is president again. They will be in the streets again. They will be burning the cities again. They will be telling us that fascism has arrived and what wouldn't you do to stop fascism? So it is not a perfect situation. But if Biden wins, well, we know. The slow descent to hell that we're on right now will continue, and it will probably accelerate. If Trump wins by a landslide, I think there's a chance of a reversion. But again, and John, I'd be happy to sit down with you on my show. Why don't we do a show maybe in October or so and see where we're at with things? Because I think it's possible that one, if not both of them, are not on the ballot. There's just nothing here that is set in stone at this point. So we shall see.
Thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
John, you're one of the good ones out there, and you got a little more gray than me, but I don't hold it against you in these times when we need people who can think straight.